Hi, Jeff Disher here again. I'm going to today talk about another issue that I've had kind of in my mind for a while is the perception a lot of people have their computer is slow, why it's slow, and some misnomers surrounding this. So, first of all, there's a lot of refrains that I end up hearing people say a lot, and I think that there could be some benefit in learning kind of how much of this is true, how much of this is false. First of all, my computer says it's running 30 programs. No wonder it is slow. I'll get into the details of that, but that doesn't necessarily explain why it's slow. In fact, it usually doesn't. Whenever I try to do anything, my computer stops and I hear it accessing the hard drive. What's it looking for? Some of you are probably aware of what this problem is. It's actually a virtual memory, or what's called swapping problem, or swap thrashing. And also, my computer is almost 3 years old. It's too slow. I'll actually get into... I'm not going to talk in too much detail about that one. Just it's more of a personal example that I can use for that. So, what is your computer running? That's the main thing when you're talking about what's slow. So, a little bit of background that's actually required to understand this is there's in operating systems there's something called a process and something called a thread. Really, you can think of a process as being the same thing as a program. There's a slight distinction, but for what we're talking about, it doesn't make a difference. A thread is one task within that program. So think of it like in terms of the thread of a conversation. You might have a lot of competing ideas going on, but each conversation has its own thread. It's one thing that follows logically from another, one thing that's dependent upon the idea before it. That idea exists in computers too. For example, this is a clip out of the activity monitor in OS X of my system recently. At this point, it shows there's 45 processes running, so 45 individual programs are actually running. And of those, 197 threads. Not something to really worry about for this, just there is a distinction. Each process is at least one thread, but I can get into more detail in a future conversation about what that is and how it matters for multiple processors. But here, you see that 91% of the processor is idle. By idle, it means it's not sitting there waiting for something to do, it's actually shut off waiting for something to do. So even though 45 programs are running, not a problem. Lots of CPU power left over. Also, something to keep in mind, and this is, you can kind of infer this based on that example, is most programs spend over 99% of their time just not doing anything, waiting. Most of the time they're waiting for you. They're either waiting for data to come from the disk or from a website, or they're just waiting for you to click on a button and tell it what to do. It waiting doesn't actually use any CPU time. So virtual memory is another thing that causes a big problem. This is everything, I try and do something and the system just kind of locks up and I hear the disk grinding away. This is a distinction between RAM versus storage. Right? You have your system RAM, which is like 4 gigabytes or something, and your system storage, which is like 500 gigabytes or something like that. RAM is what is close to the CPU. It represents what the computer is actively thinking about. A program needs data to be in RAM in order to think about it. So it fetches it from storage and puts it there. Eventually, however, it runs out of RAM because there's not very much of it. So it can end up putting unused data onto storage to make free space in RAM. When it tries to go get that, if suddenly you switch what you're doing and now it needs that memory back, that data back in RAM to do some more thinking, it has to wait and grind away at the hard drive and pull all the data off. So that really slows things down. So usually this uses, there's other mechanisms for it, but usually it's the least recently used data that's written to storage, but in general it's more the least likely to be used again soon. And there's different algorithms for that, not a detail worth talking about, but basically something can go there. You hope it's something you don't need soon. All programs when they're running, all the program itself, plus all its data that it's thinking about, all of that needs to be in RAM for it to access it. It can't access things on storage. It first loads them into RAM, operates on them, and then writes them back, or writes them to the network, or something like that. Now, something to keep in mind, and this sounds absurd, but it's actually probably a bit of an understatement. Storage is roughly 1 million times slower than RAM. It takes so long to read and write RAM back onto storage. That's why your computer feels like it came to a jarring halt when it starts doing that, because some of its operations are now becoming 1 million times slower So something that used to take a little bit of time now takes an astronomical amount of time. So the fact that it works at all is kind of impressive. Now, the other thing is that I touched on in the intro is the thing about computer age. Now, realistically, there's sort of this idea that, well, a computer is useless once it's 2 years older. Well, this used to be fairly true a long time ago, like in the 90s. Even then, it was only true if you were changing what you were doing a lot. Like, if you bought a computer last year and you're doing exactly what you're doing last year on it now, it'll feel the same speed. The computer doesn't get slower over time, it stays the same speed. The problem is when you start trying to do things that are more than what the hardware of that era can handle. Usually this isn't a real problem, but it does come up sometimes. Basically, it's just most modern workloads that we perform are things that are just being slowed down by the user. Except in the area of gaming, where I think the hardware actually does change enough that it makes a bit of a difference. But now, computers sort of peaked out at what they could do for a single task at once, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. So, since then, it's just been adding more cores, and sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it's not. So, just because something's old doesn't mean it's slow. But if you're finding it slow, there's either something wrong with it or you've changed what you're doing and you actually legitimately need something new now. But that's for a different reason. I know personally my own systems are 7 and 8 years old here. So people think that's crazy when I work in computers, but I say that's why I know that it's not crazy. There's nothing changing about it. So anyway, hope this has been informative. I want to try and put up another presentation in a few days, but feel free to email me if there's anything you'd like to suggest or anything you'd like to hear me talk about, or at least kind of do a quick shout out about some kind of basic or even more in-depth topic. So anyway, hope to hear from you. Bye.